Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson presenting her new book, Eating While Black: Food Shaming and Race in America, in conversation with Dr. Joanne Hyppolite. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues alongside our in-person programming, bringing authors and their work to our community both digitally and in Cambridge. Please check out the full event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates and browse our bookshelves from home, or indeed wherever you may be. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button on your screen and we will get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom that you are using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Eating While Black from harvard.com. Your purchases make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Cambridge. We thank you so much for your continual support during these several truly bizarre years. And thank you for supporting our authors and also the fantastic staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And lastly, as you may have experienced in these virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. We of course hope that they do not, but if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I am delighted to introduce our speakers. Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson is professor and chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland College Park. Her previous works include the book Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs: Black Women, Food, and Power. Dr. Williams-Forson's research explores the ways in which Black people, broadly defined, engage their material worlds, especially with food and food cultures, as well as historical legacies of race and gender representation and misrepresentation. Joanne Hyppolite, PhD, is the Supervisory Museum Curator of the African Diaspora at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Her expertise and interests are in diasporic cultural expressions, including foodways. Prior to joining the Smithsonian, she was the chief curator at History Miami Museum. She is the current board president of the Museums Association of the Caribbean. Tonight, they'll be discussing Psyche Williams-Forson's new book, Eating While Black: Food Shaming and Race in America. Her book illuminates how anti-Black racism operates in the practice and culture of eating, starkly exposing the rampant shaming and policing around how Black people eat. Williams-Forson contemplates food's role in cultural transmission, belonging, homemaking, and survival. Eating While Black urges us to think and talk about food in new ways in order to improve American society on both personal and structural levels. I'm very pleased to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Drs. Williams-Forson and Hyppolite.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here this evening, speaking with my colleague, Dr. Williams-Forson. And I want to say that, you know, one of the things that happened a few years ago when we opened our museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, was I looked around for who sort of the local food scholars were and was thrilled to find that you worked at the University of Maryland, and we got together, right? And we talked about,
that's right.
Had a dinner and talked about food and family and all those things. So it's great that we're able to share this space here again tonight. I'm also thrilled to be talking about this book, which I think, as I told you before in our conversations about it, is such an important contribution to food studies right now and to what the public knows about Black foodways in particular. And one of the special things about your book is that you're very self-reflexive in the book yourself. You talk about your family, you talk about your father, your stories of food shaming associated with your daughter. So it's not just about what other people are doing, it's also what's happening all around you as well, your colleagues as well. So I thought for the first question, we might sort of introduce you to our public here today if you could tell us a little bit about your family and where you're from, where you grew up, and what food traditions are part of your background. And of course, food traditions, not just one tradition,
Right,
right?
right. Not just one tradition. That's right. Thank you, Dr. Hyppolite, and thank you, Harvard Bookstore, for this invitation tonight. So I'm delighted to be in conversation. I think it'll be a really interesting and fruitful conversation. I am a Southern girl. I'm Virginia born, and at least raised in the latter years of my early childhood. But for many years, grew up in Buffalo, New York. For about 10 years was there, from 2 to 12, something like that. And so I grew up there. My dad, as I mentioned, was an itinerant, Baptist minister, but he also worked for the World Council of Churches. So we traveled a lot with him, especially in the summers when they were off doing work around social organizing. For example, the great fruit boycott out in California, and things of that nature, right? And then on the other hand, I had my mom, who is social worker and special education teacher. So I was early on in my life glued to, for example, Watergate, and really looking at and following very closely Barbara Jordan, the late senator. And so very much grew up in an activist household. As I shared with some folks earlier this week, my dad, along with Barbara Johns and many others, walked out of Prince Edward County school system in Farmville, Virginia, back in 1951. And so I'm from Prince Edward County, which is the last county in the Brown versus Board of Topeka, Kansas, right? Landmark decision. So I come from an activist background. I also come from a Black theology, liberation theology background by way of my dad. And in terms of food traditions, as I was sharing with you yesterday, I grew up in a household where, because my dad would travel around teaching and preaching, we would go with him. And our Sunday dinner would mostly be going, sometimes because we were out on the road, we would go to a smorgasbord or a buffet, as it's called today.
Yeah.
And we did that for many years. We were a much heavier family as well in terms of size, or he was. And then my dad was diagnosed with diabetes. And almost overnight, our family diet changed, right? We stopped eating white bread, rice, mostly, foods that are processed. We began to have meatless Mondays long before that was a thing. We also had tuna fish Tuesdays, tuna with peas. People talk about, raisins in the potato salad. We had tuna with peas in it. So, but our diet evolved, right, to adapt and adjust to what was happening in our family. Now, we still also had fried fish on Fridays a lot of times, or Scotty steak sandwiches, or Bocce's pizza, because we were in the seat of a very ethnic food environment. And so we took full advantage of that. But we did, over time, dial back and adjust many of the foods we were eating to adapt to what was happening in our family at that time. So I grew up with a lot of the Northern traditions, but very much we were a Southern household. It was nothing for us to have succotash any Sunday, or succotash being, tomatoes, corn, and lima beans that my mom would have made. We also had Cubano food. We had Cubans who lived upstairs from us as we got exposed to plantain very early on. And so we were very much an eclectic household of eaters, right? We had West Africans next door. So we had a lot of curries, a lot of curry chicken. And so it was actually a very sharing food environment that I grew up in. We also had government cheese, right? Because we were a family of 5 on one income for many years. And so I also, when my dad worked in with the community centers, yeah, that's how we ate as well, with government cheese and beans and rice and other food. So I have a very eclectic, I think, food palette and food background.
Yeah, I think that's a great story and a great way of sharing some of the differences in terms of what Black food and how Black people eat around the country. I myself am an immigrant American. You know, we landed here when I was 4 years old in Boston. What I ate in my Haitian household was very traditional, but what I ate outside of it was, African American food or what would be considered soul food, right? I'm putting it in
Right.
quotations.
Right.
In my neighborhood, or Irish American food in the Irish Catholic school that we were going to. And that kind of diversity in terms of Black food experiences is something you are very careful to draw out in your book. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this idea that you bring up in the book about there being a single story about Black foodways and what the problem is with that.
Yeah, good, thanks. There is, right? What I just shared with you is, as I said, very deliberately an eclectic food palette, right? Some Fridays we had buffalo wings, right? We would go up to, because we were in Buffalo, I thought it was buffalo wings came from Buffalo, and so we had, but it would be a family night at buffalo wings. I remember the special treat of going to Henry's, right, which was the sort of McDonald's precursor, the burger place, right? So my point simply is that Black folks, not only when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, but historically, we have actually had a much more broad set of foodways than people would like to acknowledge, right? And Nigerian author, novelist Chimamanda Adichie writes about the danger of the single story, right? And she says, the danger is not so much that you are telling this story, it's that you're telling it in a way that gets repeated over and over. And so then people, Black folks, for example, began to internalize that story, right? So for example, one of my chapters I have at the beginning that, or at the beginning of the book, I think I say that one of my friends, a close friend of mine one day said, we were talking about foodstuffs, and he said, yeah, you forgot, Black folks always ate scraps. And of course, the hairs on the back of my neck went all the way up. And I was like, well, yeah, no, actually we didn't. Yes, we were given a peck of meal and what was remains, right? And that's in the written record. It's also in the written record sometime around late 1800s, right? So what were Africans eating when they came to this country as early as 1400, 15, 16, 1700s? And more importantly, I want people to think realistically. We're not talking about being enslaved in today's environment. You're talking about a time when you were surrounded by foliage, right? And so if you are surrounded by foliage and you have waterways and you have woods, if you are hungry, and Frederick Douglass tells us this, right? And so there's Booker T. Washington and certainly many others would have said it, you eat from the environment, right? We are, along with indigenous people, some of the original foragers, right? Back to the landers, if you will. These are not new concepts. So we really need to understand as Black people what our food history is. It is not just from scraps, because we are resilient people. We are creative people. I think the scholarship now in Black food studies has been, if you take nothing else from the celebrations, take the creativity and ingenuity, right? And if you take that, then you have to imagine that we figured out ways to eat even when we weren't supposed to, right? Some of us, because of the work cycle, were able to have gardens. Some of us were able to be vendors and entrepreneurs. And I talk about this in Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, right? We were able to sell chicken. We were able to sell other foodstuffs. But you have to read and know these histories, because otherwise you're subjected to this knowledge that all Black people eat the same thing, and it's all fast food, and it's causing us to be obese and we die. That's the danger of the single story, because it affects not just your physical body, it affects your psyche, right? Because expressive culture is outward of who we are. So if what you're telling us and we're absorbing is that we are one-dimensional people, then, and we're confined to one-dimensional types of things, then we begin to act as if we're one-dimensional people, and we're not.
No. Yeah, those kind of, you call them distortions in myth. I come across them all the time at the museum. People have their understanding of what they think Black food is, and it underlies, you know, and their understanding, right,
Yes.
of Black food. Maybe we could switch now to talking about a bit about how food shaming works in particular. So we have these myths and distortions that exist, right? And I'd like you to address that question, to talking about how food shaming sort of works universally, not necessarily just with Black foodways, that we'll go back to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, every culture, I think, have had people who have experienced food shaming, you know. Take, for example, Greek food, grape leaves, or what you may find in Mediterranean cuisine, and people, I hate, you know, I don't like this. Or gefilte fish, or, you know, chitlins, or, you know, goat meat, you know, oxtail, right? Every culture has had people who, sushi. Oh no, I don't eat sushi. Well, you know, sushi is several different things. I mean, it's not just one thing, but we get so much of our information from popular culture. And popular culture distills information, as you know, so that it becomes palatable, if you will, or appeasing to people. And at the same time, it tends to distort and stretch the realities and the truth, right? And so every culture has experienced it. What I look at, and I acknowledge this in the book, but what I want people to be very clear about is that while every culture experiences it, Black people, it seems, tends to be very pervasive around Black folks, right? I start the book with the incident that happened in Washington, D.C. on the Metro, while a Metro worker was eating, and a photo was taken of her and posted online by a person riding the train. And that person said, here is this woman, you know, she's transgressing, right? She's misbehaving, she's eating on the train. And when this picture was taken, it was posted on social media with this caption. And she said, and when I asked the writer and the photographer said, when I asked this woman about it, she said, worry about yourself. And I'm like, absolutely, worry about it. Because what that Metro worker knew is that the rules had actually been changed. The rest of us weren't privy to it necessarily, but she knew it. And so she was doing what she was able to do, right? I think that's a metaphor for Black folks eating. We know our cultural traditions. We know what we're doing. We know as a collective, not every individual, but as a collective, we know the traditions, the cultural habits, the ways that we move about the world and embrace the foods that tend to be connected to Black folk. Just because you don't know what's going on does not mean that you have permission to police who we are and what we do. So we're waiting in Starbucks. I know what I'm doing there, and I'm looking at other people and they're there too. I don't know why it is that I have to be subjected to being policed.
Right.
I'm at the park barbecuing. Other people are barbecuing. Why am I being subjected to being policed, right? I'm reading this wonderful book that just came out by Miriam Taggart called Riding Jane Crow, African-American Women on the American Railroad. And she starts the discussion with the group of young women who were on the railroad, and they were on a train ride, and they were eating and drinking and talking, but they were escorted off the train for being too loud, right? Everybody on the train, I'm sure, was being loud, right? Because it's a train ride. That's what you do. It's joyful, it's fun. And yet it's Black people who are continuously policed and surveilled. You know, our colleague, Naoyo Kwate asked me, she said, why does Black people's food engender such opprobrium? You know, why are people so, you know, and at the time we chatted about it and everything, and I talk about this in the book, but just recently I was telling a colleague, you know, I think some of it is because society does not want to see Black people happy. And this gets at the root of that anti-Black racism, right? Black joy is power, right? If we recognized and tapped into our true Black joy, that is doing what we do and not worrying about anyone else, the amount of power we would have as a collective, blow the lid off, right? Because we are okay with who we are. That means we're okay with our political decisions. We're okay with the ways we practice our culture. We're okay with the ways we do our religion. We're okay with the way we dance and move. We're okay with the ways our bodies are fuller or flatter or what have you, right? Or thinner. We're okay with that. But we've been fed this single story of a narrative of what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to comport ourselves in order to fit with society, whether it's in eating, worshiping, whatever the case may be. And so many of us try to fit so comfortably in those boxes that we deny ourselves everyday joy. So I think that's the connection between the single story and the policing of Black folks' food and food shaming. It works as a weapon. It really does become a weapon of culture and a weapon against creativity.
Yeah, and I think that most people think food is simple, right? It's the food we eat, it's something we celebrate around, right? Traditions and holidays and, you know, and the cuisine and Food Network glorifies, right? All the different types of food we can make, you know, there are foodies, right? All over the internet right now. But what you're trying to tease out in the book is how much even food is also a conveyor of power, you know, if we look deeper and about it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about more like why is food such a powerful source to read things like policing, surveillance, other types of acts that happen as part of, you know, of Black life.
Yeah, you know, Joanne, one of the reasons it's so powerful is because it's so everyday that we can, it slides under the radar, right? We think, okay, so what are we going to have for dinner? Oh, I don't know. I'm just going to go to the store and get something. Okay, no big deal. But there are lots of considerations around that, right? From the person who's asking to the person who's making the decision. You know, one example, I can't remember if I used this one in the book, but it happened often, which was one of the things that led me to write the book. But comments like, how do we stop people from eating at McDonald's? And I had a young woman ask that one time, and not to be, and I do think I talk about this at the end of the book, not to be negative or to embarrass her, but I said, why is that your concern? Getting people to stop eating at McDonald's. And part of the reason I asked that is because hours earlier in this workshop or in panel that we were on, my colleague had come to me and sort of said, yeah, I know, girl, I had to stop at McDonald's and get my daughter something to eat on the way down here. And I was like, but she said it in a way that it was clear to me she felt a bit of discomfort and shame. Right. In part because we were at a conversation about, you know, food, and we were in San Francisco, and, you know, where food culture is hip and cool and it's organic, you know. And I thought about that and I said, you know, this woman had gone to an event earlier in the day. Then she had to get in the car with her young child and drive 2 hours down to this panel to get information, exchange information for some work that she's trying to do. So when that person, this other Black woman, asked this question about stopping people from eating at McDonald's, in my mind, I also immediately thought, you must not have kids, you know, because when you're on the road and you've got a child that's hungry, if you packed snacks and they didn't get to eat all of them, where is your next food source, right? And so, you know, you become involved in all of these dilemmas: moral, ethical, health, cost, economic, you know, all of these decisions go into that one meal. That's a powerful situation, right? And often that exchange of power ends up making someone feel bad, you know, it could. Or you're wielding power, right, over someone, how you're putting their food together, or I'm treating, but you know, you can only get so much, or watching how people, are you going to eat all of that? You know, things that we take for granted around food, we don't realize are so heavily weighted. In my work, I talk about the power dynamic of negotiation right, on a day-to-day basis, right? For example, I'll say this very quickly. When I was married to my Ghanaian West African husband, I was also finishing my doctoral work. And I tell some of these stories in the book, right? I'm very clear about one of the ways people always say immigrants are shamed, but it was the reverse in this instance, right? Because I had made some crab cakes and he sort of ate them, didn't eat them or whatever. But then we went over to some friends of cultural friends from his home town. And as soon as he walked through the door, he said, okay, this is real food. I can smell it. Okay. So even in these kinds of intimate relationships, power dynamics get exchanged. I don't think he thought twice about it. He was just saying, yeah, this food. But to me, that comment is the same as how do we get people to stop eating at McDonald's? They're offhanded remarks that people aren't thinking about, and they're speaking to folks' particular locations and their desires that they then project onto other people. So.
Yeah, it's what is it that you don't know when you're making those comments, right? About that other person's culture, their identity, the place and the space that they're in right now.
That's right. Who's in the
We
room?
often don't think about it because we think we're being innocent, but we're being complicit, right? With certain projects, racist projects, other types of medical projects that are out there. You mentioned health, and I wanted to make sure we touched on that today because one of the biggest, distortions in this, right? Black people tend to have bigger bodies, some of us, right? And so as a result of that, we're often put in the obese category, right? Which is itself a source of shame, right?
Absolutely.
So we're being told that the food that we eat that's traditional to us is what's causing that. Could you speak a little bit more about that particular, what's going on with the scientific community and biomedical community as well?
Yeah, so data has come out of late in the last couple of decades that said the BMI index, which many of us, especially on social media, have no idea what it is or anything. We just know we see people's bodies and we're like, they're gross, they're gonna die, in really negative, ugly ways, right? But the data has come out that says that you have to take the index as variable, especially as it relates to gender and ethnicity. And it rightfully should, because part of the anti-Black racism is taking a European standard and deciding it is the standard by which other bodies need to now conform. Right. And so that in and of itself is problematic. So you've got the BMI index as a problem. You have other kinds of elements that are also a problem. Around the health community saying just outright, these foods are bad, these foods are, what do we do with culture? Right? What do we do with culture? Because you cannot ask people to give up their culture. It's the thing that sustains them. And I talk about this in the chapter where I talk about the trauma of such events like Hurricane Katrina and other kinds of events in our lives when we're either voluntarily or forced to migrate. The thing that sustains you in all of that tends to be the food, right? I may not have my clothing, I may not have my language, although most of the time we don't lose that. But the thing I don't want to give up is my food, because that's going to tie me to home and memory and family or friends or my environment, right? So we have to be careful is my thing, because this we know for a lot of people that may or may not be true, but we have to be careful in the main, because when we make these assertions, the Mediterranean diet is the best. Okay, great, fine. Black folks also eat tomatoes. We eat tons of herbs because we season our food for the most part. We eat beans and legumes, and we don't all season our food with pork. Many of us are now using turkey and also liquid smoke and just a variety of other things. So what is it? What's going on that we can't eat collard greens and mac and cheese and fried chicken? We just can't at all, because right now, when we see these foods, we tend to say that's bad.
Yeah.
Well, here's the other thing I say to people, and as part of my own work around Black liberation, I'm going to share this. I could eat an impeccable diet by your standards, right? My diet could be rich in all kinds of plants, fruit, vegetables, all kinds of lemons, limes, what have you. And I can still get killed tomorrow because of the color of my skin. My food's not going to save me. Now, that doesn't mean I shouldn't do it, but I can also eat such a lovely diet and die from hypertension because I'm dealing with aggressions every time I step out my door, whether I'm at work, whether I'm on public transportation, wherever I may be, right? And we know that this is Black people's experience in America. Ahmaud Arbery was out jogging. He had no idea he was going to be gunned down. You know, we don't know what he ate that day. We didn't ask, right? But whatever he ate, it didn't save him from getting killed, right? And it certainly didn't, his health didn't save him from dying at the hands of white supremacy. So I need for us to stop making food do the heavy work that we don't want to do as a society to change up our own act, but rather what we want to do is blame food and the people who are cooking and eating the food and saying it's your problem. No, it's actually your problem, right? It's all of our problem. Because if I'm every day trying to do what I can to feel healthy, to look healthy, to be healthy, and I'm still having to grapple with can't get a loan to get a house, or can't get a loan to get my kid through college, or can't get a loan just to be able to buy, you know, continue to buy these groceries. Now, what are we talking about there, right? So we need to examine, but that's the easy thing to blame Black people in our food culture as the culprit for our death and dying. I'm not saying we don't overeat. Of course we do. Many of us do. Lots of us did during COVID, right? And so we do, but we also evolve as people. And I need that same elasticity and liberation that is extended to other communities to also be extended and received by and for Black people.
Preach, I can relate. I mean, the idea that people are often told that they have to stop eating what's their part of their identity, part of their culture, part of how they relate to their lives, you know?
That's right. That's right.
Not modify it, just eat something else completely different, right? That's a different suggestion to make, right? And also, I think you make this very strong point in the book. They were often asked to, you know, to look in spaces that are not part of our communities, you know, to look for these goods in supermarkets that are not part of our neighborhoods, or in places to shop, or in places that are not affordable for a lot of Black budgets for Black people, right? And so one of the most intriguing examples, and this will be my last question, is where you bring up the dollar store. And I had to bring it up because I thought it was so revolutionary in its own way. And what you're exploring there is, what if we took a space like the dollar store and thought about it as an answer, right? Here's how one person does it. Could you tell us that story?
Sure. Yeah, so when my daughter was young, I used to go to the dollar store, Dollar Tree in particular, because, you know, she had a party every other week and we needed some kind of, you know, little stuff, little bags and things like this. Well, over time, I began to see that the Dollar Tree was getting refrigeration. Right. And so I was like, oh, wow, what's happening here? So then I started to see butter and bread and milk and juice and breakfast products appear. And then I started looking at, so who's buying this stuff? Right. It was a range of people. And so when I wrote Taking Food Public, co-edited Redefining Food in Taking Food Public with Carol Cunahan, I was working on this article on the Dollar Tree. And it just kept coming back up. Then I was on a panel and heard a social worker say, you know, a lot of my aging clients don't eat because they're food insecure by mid-month. So they have no food, so they don't take their medication. Then I started teaching a course on food trauma and sustainability. And one of what we would do is get a client that we would try and help work through food dynamics for their organization. And one of our clients was Meals on Wheels, which serves food to aged communities, right? And then I started seeing it in my own home with my parents who don't live together, but my mom and at times my dad would not eat. So I started saying, what's happening here? Okay, part of it is community, right? Folks like to be in community. And when you have community, sometimes you will tend to eat more. But for some people, and this wasn't my parents' situation, but for some people, it's a matter of being on a fixed budget, fixed income. Can I get 20 things for $20? right? Can I get cheese, milk, eggs, maybe some turkey bacon or whatever? And our Dollar Tree started selling frozen vegetables and little fish. It's not top of the line fish, but it's some part of the fish, I guess, and so forth and so on. And then the local grocery store started selling some of the same or similar products for the same price. So that's when I said there's something to this dollar store option, because if the local grocery store, big box grocery store, wants to be in competition with the dollar store, then that means that people are buying the food. And so my question became, why aren't we allowing people to shop at the corner store and the bodega and the Dollar Tree, places that they can easily access? So I'll end this part of the conversation how I started growing up in Buffalo. When I heard that there had been a murder in Buffalo in the Black community, I immediately went to the news and said, I hope it's not on Jefferson Avenue. And of course it was. That was our local Tops. That's where my family shopped for the years that we were in Buffalo. Okay, so this happened right around Juneteenth weekend, when we're supposed to be celebrating Black food and Black culture and Black liberation. And yet you had this community of folks who were struck down by white supremacists. Here's the bigger issue for me from a standpoint of food. You have people who have lived in the Jefferson Avenue community for decades. Up until the time that Tops reopened, which was recently, where were those people supposed to get food? What happens now to their security around feeding their families and putting food on the table? Some folks say that's why you need to grow your own food. Some people can, some people can't. Some people want to, some people don't, and we need to allow folks that flexibility. But what I want us to think about there, the reason I end with this, is because we have to allow for food flexibility. Because people know their lives better than other people know their lives, right? We all know what's going on with us. We know our pocketbooks in terms of what we can afford. We know what we have access to. And again, we are resilient, we are creative. I may get some things from the Dollar Tree and then get some other things from a vegetable stand and get some other things from over here. Why am I not allowed that flexibility if those things are going to help me to eat foods that are going to give me joy? Right? Because at the heart of it, that's what it's all about, right? Is thriving and surviving. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams-Forson, for writing this book and for your insight into its contents. And like I said, I think it's much needed, because we have spent a lot of time talking about all the great recipes and the cookbooks and the foods that are out there, but we don't talk about, why it is we're being, we're shamed away from the foods that are traditional to us, and important.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much.
Sarah. We're gonna pass the mic back over to the Harvard Bookstore to start with the Q&A portion of today.
Good.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for bringing up some really good points. Sorry, we also have a lot of great questions from the audience, so I'm losing nouns. So Cassie Riva asks, your conversation is bringing to mind recent instances of, quote, gentrification and exoticism of Black food as well. Yeah. Kale and sweet potatoes becoming health food crazes for white upper middle class people, for example. Is there historical precedent for that in the 20th and 19th centuries?
Is there historical precedent for the, I guess, for the appearance of kale or greens and sweet potatoes?
Or sort of being suddenly sort of white people Columbusing them, I think is sort of what they're.
Sure. Well, I want to answer this question by very quickly starting with an article that my colleague Nancy Mirabal here at the University of Maryland was telling me was written by a friend and colleague of hers, and the article is titled "Why Do Rich People Love Quiet?" Why do rich people love? And the subtitle is "The Sound of Gentrification is Silence." Okay, the sound of gentrification is silence. Now, if you Google it, because I don't want to butcher the author's name, but it's an article that was recently published in The Atlantic. Now, why do I start with that? Because the silencing of Black people around the foods that they tend to eat is part of this gentrification narrative, right? So you ask, for example, whether or not kale and sweet potato. We've been eating kale and sweet potatoes half our lives, right? That's what some of the cruciferous vegetables, some of the leafy vegetables. So I remember when the whole kale craze came out, I was like, this is not new for Black people, right? We've been growing these foods since we've been in this country, and remembering that Black people were brought to this country specifically, many of us, because of our agricultural knowledges. So yes, we've been eating these foods ever since we've been here. This is not new, but like many foods, chitlins included, once white folks decide it's okay, then it becomes okay. The oxymoron for me is that we will demonize Black foodways, but we will revere Southern foodways. Right? And are those different? Are they the same? We will demonize the foods that many Black folks eat, many of whom came by way of the South, but we will absolutely love some kind of glazed pig ear on bone china because it's served under a different umbrella. There's a problem there. That needs to be examined, and we need to call it out. And that's not about praise. That's about recognizing that that's an anti-Black racist agenda underway. Because if I can keep you from celebrating what gives you joy, I can also keep you oppressed, repressed, depressed, and oppressed, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We have a question from Therese Nelson, who says, this book feels so much like a meditation on the pathology of food justice activism and a digestion of the results of well-meaning best practices that have transformed our food system. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of what's worked and what we need to let go of when advocating for our communities.
Good. Thank you, Therese. How are you tonight? Thank you for that question. It's a big one, right? That's a big question. But I will just say right off the bat, I do think that going back to the land has worked, right? Absolutely. Growing our own food has worked in some respects, right? Where where it becomes a problem for me is when we argue that that is the best, primary, and almost only way of obtaining food, right? So I need to be very clear publicly to say, I am not against veganism, vegetarianism, breatharianism, pescatarian. I'm not against any of them. I'm not against you growing your own food. It's when you take that as the norm and therefore shame other people when they don't engage in those practices. That's when I think that's the thing we need to let go of, right? If you want to ask what's working, everything may be working, right? The thing we need to let go of is allowing everything not, to be in a position where we try to stop everything from working. That's the thing we need to let go.
Enforcing a particular thing.
We enforce a particular thing. That's when we start to have the problems, because it's not in everyone's best health to eat a particular way that may work best for you.
Right.
Some people need to have different things. And, I remember very quickly a story that a colleague, Breeze Harper, told. And she's one of the first came out with the book Sister Vegan, right? She tells this story about, she's vegan, has been a vegan for a very long time, but during one of her pregnancies, I feel like I recall this, she had to take fish oil pills or something along those lines. And she said, folks just came for her, and I'm like, how horrible. She's trying to help her body and her child. And Breeze, correct me if I was wrong on this, but I believe that was what you said. But that's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Right. Exactly. Which that's so bizarre to me, because usually, that's such a, people are generally kind of encouraged to take that as a supplement. And so that's very bizarre. We have a question from Tatiana Washington, who asks, what are your thoughts on modifications of traditional foods for healthier options? Maybe kind of substitution, things like that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tatiana. I think you should do what works best for you. And I think we all have to be careful about how we decide on the definition of healthy. Okay, again, absolutely. If it's healthier for you to make and switch out these different ingredients, you should do that. Let me just give you a quick example. When I worked at the pregnancy aid center here in my area, I was talking with the folks there, or I was interviewing them or something, and they said one of the things they have a great deal of difficulty with is with immigrant women, because they're trying to give them caloric information, but they don't quite know how to translate the foods that are their cultural foodways into these calories that they are either required or not required to have. All right. So in my own household many years back, when my ex-husband did not have fufu, he would substitute cream of wheat. I think it's perfectly fine to make those substitutions, modifications, and so forth. You have to. Again, where the problem comes in is when we insist upon it for other people. You should do what's best for you and define healthy for you. But let's be clear about trying to define healthy for other people. That's when I think we run the risk of food shaming and food policing.
Right, right. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, do you think there should be education amongst Black folk on healthier options for food to avoid, they say, to avoid diseases that are common? If so, how do you go about food education without food shaming?
Great question. I think there should be education amongst all of us about food options and what those various food options can do for your entire body. See, we get hung up on the word healthy because again, as I just said, what's healthy for you is not necessarily healthy for someone else. I'll share a quick story that's in this book. I had a colleague who the entire time she was here in the East Coast, she was a vegetarian. She moved to another part of the country and her whole body started to feel very apathetic and just listless and so forth. This went on for years until one day she said her physician told her, I need you to just try some red meat. Okay, just try some. I know you don't, you're a vegetarian, blah, blah, blah. And she did, and it changed her entire blood count, platelets, what have you. So again, and I may not have it exactly right now, but I do have it in the book. So this is again what I mean. You have to be careful about what you define as healthy, because what may be healthy for you could be a food allergy for someone else. It could be life and death for someone else, and they may not even know it. So in terms of educating Black people, we need to educate all of us. Right? All of us need to be, we need to self-educate. This isn't just a Black issue. Do we have particular diseases that are rampant in Black communities? Absolutely. Do we have diseases that are rampant in other communities? Absolutely. So why are we invested in Black people changing their food, but not other folks? And more importantly, one of the biggest diseases we deal with that it can affect my health every single day, as I've said, is racism, classism, sexism, those kinds of things. Fix those things as well. While you're worried about what I'm putting in my body, also think about the things that are going into my mind, the things that are affecting my soul every day, the things that are affecting how I move about the world, right? They need to be in conversation with the foods that I'm eating, because if you are not fixing those things, now you've misplaced the problem. And so you're regurgitating it for the next generation.
Thank you. Thank you for making that point. We have last question, an anonymous attendee who asks, have you noticed a recent change in any of these conversations after the release of High on the Hog? Like I think it was a book and a Netflix series sort of.
Sure. Change in these conversations. I'm not sure what you mean by a change. I think we're having more of these conversations. Jessica Harris is a mentor. And I appreciate Dr. Harris for all the work she's done. She and so many others, and I reference her here primarily because of the work she did in writing the book High on the Hog. Now, Netflix and its distribution of it has informed so many people about the beauty and variety of Black cultures, right, as it relates to food. And so I think that's a wonderful thing. All I'm simply saying is, while we are celebrating, let's also recognize that food is undergirded by power. Food is also undergirded by issues of race and class and gender, and that even as you are celebrating, you can also be involved in shaming and being shamed. even as you're celebrating, right? These things, we have to have these bigger conversations. That's what my book is about. It's not about reducing. I'm trying to open up the conversations we have so that while we're celebrating, we also recognize the racist legacies of stereotypes that go along with Black folks eating. We're still shamed and made to feel bad about eating chicken and watermelon,
Right.
and other foods. We also we are shamed around if we grow food or if we don't grow food. So that's all a part of eating high on the hog as well. Right? Or low on the hog, whichever way you want to go. And so I'm saying I want us to expand our conversations. So now y'all have got the celebration down. Now let's move into other areas of Black food conversations because they're all important. And we are here for Black people's liberation and for their ability to move about this world with joy and freedom. And the best way I think to do that is to recognize Black expressive culture, of which food is one element.
Thank you so much. And actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to close this. We have a kind of a comment from Erica Thompson. She says, greetings to you, Dr. Williams-Forson from Houston's African-American Library. Right. I love what you said about pathologizing Black folks' food waste, particularly around soul food, which is many things, but is also freshly made. That's right. Most of the grocery store is comprised of food that has a shelf life of 1 billion years, and somehow that is rarely ever interrogated for the negative effects on our health. Thank you for this fascinating talk, and I cannot wait to read this work.
Awesome.
So I just wanted to pass that on to you before we close. And thank you so much to both of you for this conversation. This is really, I mean, we all need food to live. Don't mess with people for what they're eating. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who have been listening on with us. And again, the link has been posted in the chat. Please go to harvard.com to purchase copies of this remarkable book, Eating While Black, and have a lovely evening. Support your independent bookstores, be safe, and thank you so much, good doctors, for joining us this evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.